As far as I know, I'm the only full-time prosecutor in the entire country that just handles animal abuse and animal neglect cases. I work for the city of Los Angeles. I started doing this exclusively about 8 years ago. I see cases ranging from the most horrible abuse, torturing of animals, dog fighting, cockfighting, and maybe the worst is animal neglect, where people just let their animals die, very slow deaths. And on top of that, I propose legislation, work on policies for the city and the state of California, and I consult with other cities and the rest of the country. The most recent legislation that I've worked on is actually a forfeiture bill in California that's currently in Sacramento, and that will allow the government to seize the property of people who fight dogs. Some of the most disturbing cases involve domestic violence. There is such a link between animal abuse and violence against people, and we see it so often where men are abusing women and children in the family, and almost every time if there's a pet, we see that the pet has also been abused. And if we see that pets are being abused, if we look deeper into the family situation, more often than not we find out that children and the women are abused too. The link is so obviously there. When I first started doing the job, I was very excited and very passionate and emotional. I found that the emotion was getting in the way of being a good lawyer. I've had to really develop a professional approach towards these cases and distance myself in some ways from the emotionalism. Looking at the photos of these animals in my cases, I can tell you that I have friends who are police detectives that do homicide cases and won't look at the photos of my cases. Judges who make the photos force us to seal them in envelopes. So it is hard to deal with. I think the way I handle it is knowing that these animals don't die in vain. In fact, the few times that I've actually cried in the car on the way home is not because of what happened to an animal, but because the court system didn't do what it should have done. There was no justice. And I think also rescuing animals at home, the ones that need help, that helps me balance some of the tragedy that I see every day at work. A lot of people say, well, how do you go into a shelter? How do you rescue animals? Doesn't it make you sad? If I was just watching, it would be sad, but knowing that I'm doing something, it's not enough, but I'm doing something, I think that's what makes it livable for me. I think it's very noble that there's prosecutors around the country, special prosecutors that are taking a special interest in animal cases. But until animal cruelty is treated like any other crime, as a serious crime, and not something that is special, until that happens, I don't think we're going to be making really inroads into animal cruelty in this country. Every prosecutor in every county and city in this country needs to know the laws on animal abuse and know that it's okay and encouraged to prosecute these cases. When that happens, the judges will be educated and the juries will be educated. So I place the responsibility on the prosecutors who learn the law, and then they encourage the police to investigate it, and the judges will do the appropriate action. I think the second most important thing is that law enforcement around the country has to also accept responsibility for handling animal cruelty. This is not a job for animal control officers, for the people that do licensing and dog catching. This is a crime that needs to be handled by the same cops that are trained to handle murder, rape, and robbery. The FBI actually lists animal cruelty as one of the best indicators of future criminal activity. When I was growing up, I remember pyromania was an indicator that if a small child was playing with fire, that was a red flag, that this child could be in for trouble later on. Now it is well documented that maybe the best predictor of future violence is children who are abusive to animals. And I'm not talking about young children who are experimenting, learning how to touch an animal and may touch it a little bit roughly. We're talking about children who get pleasure and joy out of torturing animals. I see it all the time. I know teachers that see it. And yet, right now in this country, there's really no structure for knowing how to respond, except, unfortunately, in many cities, it's just transferring that child to another classroom or another school, and that's not the answer. I often ask children, if you were a judge and you were in a courtroom and you had somebody in front of you that had tortured an animal, what would you do? And while most people will half-jokingly say, let's execute the person or put them in jail. The serious answer is that there does need to be a certain amount of punishment, but punishment alone is not going to change behavior. I truly believe that we need a psychological protocol that counsels people on getting in touch with empathy and compassion and why they are doing this to animals. And I think it's important for the country to recognize that there is two forms of abuse. There are those people who purposely go out of their way to torture and hurt animals. That's one protocol. The other is almost this phenomenon of people who neglect animals and let these animals die a slow death. It's not the same as the person who tortures or burns an animal. And to my knowledge, there's no protocol in this country for responding to that and counseling those people. And until we come up with that, punishment alone is not going to stop animal neglect. Statistically, there's been a tremendous rise in the number of animal cruelty cases, but it very much raises the question, like with cancer, how much of it was well documented years ago and that we didn't know about. I think that there was a phenomenal amount of animal cruelty and neglect that there was just no response to. But I also think that while we are doing a much better job of prosecuting and investigating these cases, I'm disturbed and think that there is an increase in it, that I think that violence has become an option for too many people, especially in the inner city. We have children growing up, and this is a new phenomenon, young children watching animals being fought, being tortured and abused, while a black and white police car drives by without a response. There couldn't be a worse message to be sent to children and our community when we don't respond. And I see more and more inner city violence involving animals, and to this date, we're not responding enough. And what does it say about society? Well, I think Gandhi said it best. To paraphrase Gandhi, a society will be judged by the way it treats its animals. And we're not doing a very good job. I'd say right now we'd probably get a failing grade from Gandhi.